All right, it is 2 o'clock, and I will say that the webinar will begin. Welcome all the people who are here participating in Forests, Grains and Berries, What's Hot in IPM Tools for Weed Control. And today I'm really excited that we have three wonderful guests with us to answer all of your questions about IPM. So we have Antonio DiTommaso, he's a professor at Cornell University. So hi, Antonio. Norris Muth, Associate Professor at UNITA, and you're going to have to pronounce that properly for me. And we have Hilary Sandler, Extension Associate Professor, Integrated Pest Management and Weed Science at the University of Massachusetts. And someone just checked we were recording, and we are recording, so we're good. All right, so before we get into the webinar, I just want to let you know that, if I can get this to move, that there is going to be a recording of this webinar, and it's going to be up on our website, hopefully probably tomorrow by the time we've uploaded it, but in a few days on this link right here. So the way this webinar is structured, there's lots of time for Q&A. So, as the folks are speaking, please think about questions that you could have for them. And we're going to try and keep it really current and useful for what's happening right now. So let's begin with Hilary, and I'm gonna see if we can unmute. Let's see here, there we go. All right, Hilary, so can we hear you?
Can everybody hear me all right?
Yeah, we can, great, okay, we're all working. All right, wonderful. So would you like to introduce a little bit about yourself? And we also have a couple of things that you wanted to talk about, and we have slides here.
Okay, so as Anna had mentioned, I'm an Extension Associate Professor at the UMass Cranberry Station. So I'm located just a few miles west of the Cape Cod Canal in southeastern Massachusetts. I've been doing weed science and IPM here for about 27 years. So our main projects are, since we are a perennial crop system, most of our weed issues are also perennial. And so that creates a lot of challenges for us because most of our weeds are very tenacious, requires yearly treatments to be able to make any headway against a lot of our weed issues. So I was going to talk a little bit about a new resource that came out just a couple of years back. This identification guide was actually first published in French by a Canadian group up in Quebec. And it was such a wonderful identification guide with great photos that we were able to actually, through the Northeast IPM Center, get some funding and get it translated into English. We also expanded it quite a bit. But I think if we flip to the next slide. What I wanted to really kind of talk about to those of you that are out there is just a different way of trying to think about dealing with weeds. Because when you're out there doing IPM for insects, it's so much easier. You can just go out there and sweep net and you can count insects and have a much better idea of an action threshold. Weeds are a little more challenging, especially in perennial systems, because how do you gauge when it's really worthwhile to start doing a management technique for a weed population? And so what we worked on was developing a criteria set, looking at different biological aspects of the weed to try to get a sense of how important it is. And then it would end up having a priority rating, and being whether it was a 1, 2, 3, or 4, then this would give growers a tool by which they could say, okay, this is a number 1, I really don't have to worry about it too much, or gosh, this is a number 4, I got to get on top of this as soon as possible. So this slide shows the criteria that we used, and we look at the impact of a weed. And again, we did this for cranberries, but I think that this type of thought process could be used in any other kind of, especially a perennial specialty crop system. Thinking about the biological form or the type of a given weed, whether it's similar to your crop plant or how it may differ, whether it produces rhizomes or stolons, or whether it actually is an annual. Thinking about its invasive and reproductive capacity, whether it does have very strong perennial parts to it, or if it really is propagating by seed only, and how well it's adapted to whatever environment. Obviously, we looked at the cranberry environment, but how well is it adapted to whatever your crop system environment is? So we went through and we would look at the weed, and we would give it a number of points for each of these 4 categories, going from 1 to 8. And then I think if we go to the next slide, here's an instance of what one of the pictures in the guide would look like. And if you look at the upper left-hand corner, you'll see 3 squares. And so this gives you a very quick visual that this is actually a priority 3. So it's definitely a weed of concern. The more blocks you have, the more concern it would be. So as you're going through the weed ID guide, you would find your weed of choice and you'd go, oh boy, I better really start to think about seeing how bad this is out on my farm, and whether I would need to, you know, what kind of management strategies I would need to do. But this also gives you an idea for each of the weeds that we have in there. There's, you know, there's different stages of the plant that are represented to help with identification. And then I can't show it in the photograph, but there's also some text that gives additional description. So if we flip to the next one. Oh, okay, so I guess we didn't have the other slide, but there's actually a table in the back that lists all of the weeds and gives their priorities and how we arrived at them. And what I really like about this is that you can see how I arrived, or the other authors and I arrived at a priority, and you could go through and say, well, that's not really the true for mine, and you could make adjustments so that it really can make it very tailored to your situation. So I just want to let folks know that this resource is available. If you're interested in a copy, it really does have a lot of wonderful photos in it. I'd be happy. They're available for $25 through the station. If you buy them online, they're closer to $40. Even though it was started for cranberries, it really does, I think if you live in the New England area, you'll find a lot of weed species that may be quite common in your systems. So that's just kind of that part, and I'll just spend 2 minutes talking about some of the invasive species that we've been dealing with. Primarily Phragmites has been a weed that's been coming up more and more. It started encroaching in some of the areas around our cranberry farm systems, and now it's actually been showing up on the farm, in the bogs, and it's really becoming quite a big problem. The other one of concern is Japanese knotweed, which again started out on the edges and now is finding its way onto the bog. So kind of the approach that we're doing is really just trying to educate growers about how to identify these plants early on and to do quick management for them. So that's, am I about in the right time frame for that, Jana? Okay. You're gonna have to put yourself back on. So I can't hear you.
There you go. I'm so sorry.
Okay, no problem.
All this technology here. So I've taken off the PowerPoint so we can see each other. If you have a question, if you scroll your mouse over your screen, you'll see at the bottom there's a little place where it says Q&A, and you can ask a question there. And if folks have any questions for Hilary, specifically around the guide or around cranberries or anything that she's touched on, please feel free to pop your question in there. And Nancy is keeping tab of our questions that are coming in. And is there a question that's come in so far, Nancy?
Yeah, there is a question. Why are some plants invasive in natural areas and not in agronomic systems?
Wow, yeah, that's a really good question. You know, I think probably some of it may have to do with the type of management techniques that we do within our farm systems, you know, within agronomic or even specialty crop systems. You know, there may be certain herbicides, or the way that we're managing it, you know, probably just makes it a little less hospitable to having an invasiveness. But, you know, thankfully it, you know, at least for our cranberry systems, it hasn't been as much of a problem. But we are starting, maybe the fact now that we're starting to do lower and lower inputs, you know, it could be making, you know, our cranberry farm system more hospitable to being able to support invasive species. I can't really speak to agronomic crops, but I would imagine that they probably have their share of invasive species as well. Perhaps when Tony or Norris come on, they may have a thought.
Yeah, actually, I was going to say we can open it up if Tony and Norris, if you want to add anything to that, feel free to unmute yourself and just chime in. So it's nice that we have all three of you. So if there's anything you want to add, feel free.
Yeah, I was just going to mention, you know, one of the main reasons that Hilary was, you know, kind of alluded to is that in many of our annual agronomic cropping systems, tillage is still very important. And tillage basically breaks up a lot of, particularly for these perennial invasives like the Phragmites and the Japanese knotweeds. Very often frequent tillage is just, it's just not, you know, conducive to these plants establishing well. I mean, you could break up rhizomes and so forth, but the tillage occurs so frequently in these systems that they're controlled. Where they're a problem in agronomic systems is in no-till systems, which are more closely related to what the kind of the cranberry situation where you're not tilling up these areas. So least disturbance is going to allow some of these perennials, that Japanese knotweeds and so forth, to dominate. So that's why we don't see them typically in corn and soybean if we're tilling. So, and the herbicide selection is much wider, of course.
Great, thank you. And Nancy, are there any other quick questions that have come in?
Nope, that's it so far.
Okay, great. All right. So Tony, let's switch over to you, and if you'd like to introduce yourself and bring up any topics that you think would be helpful for people at this point in the year, and what you'd like to share about your research and what you're up to.
Right, and so as you mentioned, my name is Tony DiTommaso. I'm a weed scientist, weed ecologist at Cornell University in upstate New York. And my areas of interest particularly are in wheat seed bank dynamics. So really kind of trying to get a handle on, you know, wheat seed banks, which are a real issue, particularly in agronomic systems, and been very interested in the impact of climate change. So any of you have questions regarding, you know, possible spread of particular weeds, you know, my interest in weeds that are more of a southern origin. So, you know, species like Johnson grass, the morning glories, or something I'm very interested in, and working with colleagues across the country to look at their movement based on projected climate change. Very interested in biological weed control. So I've been working with, you know, research entomologists, collaborating, looking at IPM tactics for weed management, and particularly an invasive species of natural areas called swallowwort, which is a real problem in the northeastern U.S. and now starting to be a problem in the Midwest. This is a milkweed relative, perennial herbaceous vine that really are problematic. Some of you might have heard of these plants because they're, it made the news because one of its main drawbacks is that it's also considered a dead end for the monarch butterfly, because it's closely related to the milkweeds. For some reason, a small percentage of monarch butterflies do lay their eggs on these plants because they occur in old fields where you'll typically could see a milkweed as well. But the eggs will hatch of the monarch, but they will not, the larvae will not survive typically 24 to 48 hours. So, you know, environmental concern, you know, conservation issues. And so also interested in IPM techniques for this weed and other weeds, mowing, including herbicide work. So really kind of looking at the ecology, really understanding the biology and ecology of these plants is really what I'm all, you know, my kind of my research focus on that, and then thinking about what would be the best strategies, IPM strategies. This time of year, a couple of, you know, pointers for you. Obviously, depending on where you are, what part of the country, here in the Northeast, it's been rather cool and wet for the last couple of weeks. We had a real warm spell, so things got going and then they kind of stopped in their tracks, but we're now getting our summer annuals coming. So our growers, particularly field crop growers, are certainly, very interested in, and you should be looking at what is coming up. Winter annuals. The winter has been relatively minor here. I mean, it's been safe for a lot of our weeds, and so you should be looking in your no-till fields at things like, things like chickweeds and some of the dandelions and sow thistles. So a lot of these, if you're going to be doing what's called a burn down or tillage, we're seeing a lot of these perennials, but especially winter annuals, have survived well the winter, and they're going to be an issue. So heads up there. One thing that I did want to mention is it's really important for our growers, those of you out there who are growers or even extensionists, extension educators, to really push the idea of identifying and recognizing weeds that you've never seen on your farm before or in your area. It's the if you notice something you haven't, and most growers know their fields, they know them very well, and some of our consultants who work with some of these growers, if you notice anything that you haven't seen in the past, that should, set off an alarm bell, and you should get that plant, take a picture of it, identify, send it to an extensionist. I'd be happy to look at it. I'm sure any of us here would be happy to help you identify it, because that early detection, I cannot overstate how many issues could be solved by just being able to identify those plants early on. And I'm sure that's going to be the same kind of idea that Norris is going to tell you about some of the, when you're working in forested areas and so forth. So, and how do you get those new plants? I have, my experience has, taught me contaminated crop seed. As much as you think that a lot of it is pure, there are going to be weed seeds in there. And depending on what part of the country they're coming from, you're going to have introduction of species you've never seen. I have seen contaminated equipment shared, and I would remember seeing tillage equipment where you still have rhizomes of quackgrass or perennial sow thistle hanging from a piece of equipment that's being transported from one region to another, not just one farm. So that's just something that one needs to really keep an eye on. And so, what are some resources that are out there? I would encourage you, similar to what Hilary mentioned, depending on what part of the country you're in. If you're in the Northeast, there's some, really good weed guides. I mean, certainly the weeds of the Northeast, this is kind of the standard, that everybody is looking at. If you're wondering, there's a revision on its way. We're hoping by the end of the year, early next year, a revised version that would include 50 additional species. And I'll be helping to revise that. So it'll be, I'm really excited about that. But certainly your regional field crop guidelines, the Mid-Atlantic out of Penn State and some of the adjoining states have put together a really, really nice field guide that provides a lot of valuable information. And so I would encourage all of you to look at your regional weed guides, because they provide more, not just herbicide information, but also integrated pest management across the board in field crops. And this is especially important as well for organic growers. There's some of you out there working with organic growers. They're obviously herbicides are not an option. So really thinking about what some of the next steps are. And I would say just kind of one last, heads up on for those folks out there that do use herbicides. One thing that I've noticed, especially with, Roundup Ready crops, or where we have this great flexibility of when we can use these herbicides, that in some cases we've pushed the envelope a little too far, where we're spraying plants that are just simply too big. And one should know that no matter how good these post-emergent herbicides are, size matters. And if they're too big, the effect is just, the efficacy is not going to be as great as when they're 4 inches or 5 inches or 6 inches tall. So just a heads up to be careful about that, to try to be within the timing that the label allows. And that's something that I've noticed over the last few years. And one last point related to weather that I want to make. I know I've said a number of last points, but this is because we witnessed it last year. tremendously dry summer here in upstate New York and in many parts of the Northeast, almost record-breaking. And I saw in some cases growers or applicators putting down herbicides when the plants were tremendously water stressed. And then you know, the efficacy of our herbicides when plants are water stressed is pretty well nil. You're not only wasting money, contamination of the environment. So please, you need to apply these herbicides when the plants are actively growing. It is not a good idea to do so when the plants are either, you know, water stressed like last year, as much as we want to get in there. So that was just something I noticed in traveling around the Northeast last year, that kind of, you know, I kind of want to at least alert folks, please, let's not try to do that. But anyway, that's kind of, I'd be happy to take on any questions, weed ID questions, species that are on the move that folks think might be, you know, coming to them or that they've looked at. So I'll stop here, Jana, if there's.
Okay, great. I can ask Nancy if there are any questions. I have a question actually, which about wet weather, and I was saying to you earlier, I'd flown to Indianapolis last weekend, and I was just flew over rain-soaked fields and flooded rivers, and so I can see it's probably just not in the Northeast, but it's probably a bigger problem. So what should growers be thinking about or be concerned about, given all the water that we've had this spring, and what is it in particular they need to be paying attention to? Just like you were saying last year, don't spray when you've got a stressed out plant. What are some good pieces of advice for when you've got waterlogged and really wet fields and had a wet spring? What are some good things to think about?
Right. I think most growers know, I mean, you know, first of all, the fields have to dry out, and you cannot get in there. You're going to be planting in suboptimal conditions. First of all, that's, you know, your soil's just, you know, compaction that one could create. One advantage is that generally most weeds, if your crop can't go in, your weeds are generally not going to be doing too well. Anaerobic conditions where lack of oxygen, you know, there are very few plants that can do well. And that's, if you're wondering, that's one reason why they actually flood rice paddies. Rice can grow well and doesn't need water, but they flood in many parts of the world to control weeds, because too much water, they, you know, it's not just not good for crops, but generally speaking, except for where, you know, you're looking at cranberries, that's might be another situation. The issue with rain, and it's just a question of pushing back the planting time. And then again, timing your herbicide applications if you're, you know, looking at herbicides. For organic growers, it's a real problem because tillage is important for them. And in this case, they really need to wait for their fields to dry out. So it's more of a delay waiting. Now, I doubt that many growers, if say growers had already applied, planted before these rains came and had put down a herbicide, the issue with having too much rain is sometimes the herbicide is washed right through, especially for pre-emergent herbicides that are applied to the soil. So drought doesn't allow them to be activated, but too much rain can wash them out and leach them out, and that's problematic as well. So right now, I think everyone's kind of just hoping that they can, you know, get in. And I know up in the upper Midwest, the Dakotas, Minnesota, they've had some really nice weather after some terrible weather, and they've really pushed up their planting rates. I think we're up to 80%, 90% of corn planting already, where they were really behind about a week or so ago, and same in Iowa. So hopefully folks can get in there, but everything's going to be pushed back, including herbicide applications and tillage operations.
All right, great. Okay, so Nancy, do we have any questions that have come in for?
Two questions, yes. Stilt grass treatment and timing in Mid-Atlantic Virginia?
Oh, stilt grass. I assume they're talking about Japanese stilt grass. That's a tough one that we actually see, and Norris, you may be able to speak to it, because it's also it's problematic actually in understory or forest. So
They,
Norris, do you have some suggestions?
I think so. They, I think the most recent ideas I've heard about successful or modest success in treating microstegium, stilt grass, Nepal grass. These might be other names it goes by. is to use a pre-emergent herbicide. In some cases, people are having some success with that. It's an annual, so depending on your situation and the size of the infestation, if you mow it or pull it, then before it sets seed, then potentially that works. But of course, that's really only going to be something you want to do in a small infestation. In a large infestation, it's not going to be very practical. Tony, is this the book you were talking about for the Mid-Atlantic region?
The one I was referring to is actually for field crops.
Oh, okay, for field crops, yeah.
Yeah, just kind of, herbicides and tillage, but that is for natural areas, that's an excellent guide.
And then for microstegium, again, one of the resources I'll mention is a listserv that gets archived where people have asked that question several times every year. And you can go to this listserv and type up microstegium control, and you can get a lot of expert opinions on what they've specifically used as far as chemical treatments or mechanical treatments and the like.
Okay, and the other question I have is, are there thresholds for treating weeds in an IPM approach similar to insects? And if so, what are they?
Oh, that's a great question. Hilary probably wants to take a stab at it too.
Yeah, well, I can hear what you say. I know it's been a real challenge to try to find those thresholds. And we've actually tried to do some different economic analysis, like say with narrowleaf goldenrod or loosestrife that come in and looking at plant densities and how they impact yield and trying to relate those to thresholds. And so trying to come up with something very quantitative, like, you can only have, if you have more than 50 in a square foot, that would be something to enact a management strategy. As far as I know, I'm not really aware of anything like that. The only thing I know is that we have some that have a 0 threshold, such as in cranberries. If we have a dodder infestation, really our tolerance for that is 0. And that's why we came up with this priority ranking system, because it was some way to grapple with the presence of the plant in that area, as well as the impact, trying, because I really think that certain plants in certain environments will do better than, so like what's happening on my farm may not be the same as a weed impact that may be happening on Tony's farm, just due to our management approach. So that's why these priorities really allow you that flexibility to tailor some sort of sense of how to prioritize your weed species. But it's something I know we as weed scientists, we've struggled with. I don't know what you think, Tony.
I'll just add that I co-teach an IPM course here at Cornell with an entomologist, and in the past we had a plant pathologist. All 3 of us would teach the course, and it was interesting how we bounced around this question, because obviously from an entomology, that's our one of the mainstays of IPM is being able to have a threshold of 5 mites per leaf, and that's when you're now going to take action. I'll just concur with Hilary and say, and I'll give you a specific example. A colleague of mine did some work here at Cornell where they looked at the impact of velvet leaf wheat density on corn over 4 different years. And in all 4 years, different weather in all 4 years, different yield reductions. So in some years, density had no effect at all. It's almost like the weeds weren't there. In other years, one plant could have reduced your yield by 50%. And what it came down to, and what I think, and it gets back to what Hilary says, it's really farm site specific. It's very weather specific. And it's something I'm really interested in is can we make management decisions early in the season by looking at weather and looking at how competitive interactions between the weed and the crop align. So are there some years where early weather will favor a crop over a weed, and that's the year that you can maybe relax a little bit? You still need to control, but that's where maybe we're going to get a no effect of density. Where other years, the weather, i.e. if the crop is just not doing well under those kinds of weather conditions, there are weeds that are going to do very well. And the reason we can't tell you that specifically is that there are different weeds on each field. In I mean, there's not just one weed, and so
Right.
which ones
There's
win out
always a
makes
lot.
a big difference. And so, and I think that's the challenge from a weed science perspective as to why we can't come up with that. But it's something that boy, it'd be great if we could say 5 plants in a 2-foot row of corn will reduce your yield by 3% or 10%. We're just not there.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions, Nancy?
Not at the moment.
Okay, great. All right, so maybe we can move over to Norris, and I can, if you want to unmute yourself and introduce yourself. I'd love to hear what you have to say about the topic. And also just to remind people, if you want to ask a question, if you scroll your mouse over the screen, you'll see there's a little Q&A at the bottom, and you can click on that and ask a question. And you can also do it anonymously. You can just, I think on the right-hand side, there's a little button that you can ask anonymously, so you don't have to feel self-conscious. And so please feel free to add your questions. So Norris, would you like to introduce yourself? And I will go to the slide that you put up when you let me know when to do that.
Or whenever you want. It's not anything very attractive to look at. It's a long list of resources and websites that I think will be mostly useful to people if they refer back to the webinar, probably. I don't know if they could even see them all when they're looking now, but they're all there, so that'll be helpful, hopefully, if people want to go back to it. But I'm Norris Muth. I'm at Juniata College in central PA, central Pennsylvania. I'm a plant ecologist. Most of my work deals with invasive plant species and the influence of invasive species on trophic webs. My background's not terribly applied. My research becoming a bit more applied these days, trying to look at things like hemlock woolly adelgid impacts and impacts of tree of heaven and other scenarios. And I'm trying to do my work not only in natural areas, but also in urban forests as well, and highlight the differences you can get by using native species in landscapes and in urban forests compared to non-native species. Work that's similar to Doug Tallamy, if anybody's familiar with Doug Tallamy's really excellent book, Bringing Nature Home. So that's sort of what I do. I would, as far as things I want to highlight, Tony's already highlighted maybe one of my #1 points, which is paying attention to new things in your landscape or in your fields, right? That could be new vegetation, plants you're not familiar with, particularly if they seem aggressive or large population. So plants you're not familiar with, as well as plant disease that you're unfamiliar with. I tend to be more of a forest-oriented person. And to be honest, as much as I study invasive plants most of the time, my larger concerns are really pathogens of our native forest species in terms of the effects we've already seen on American chestnut, on elm, things that we're seeing with ash, as far as emerald ash borer, threats to maple from Asian longhorn beetle, threats to black walnut from thousand canker disease. These are these pathogens of our native forest trees. When they have an impact, that can be a huge impact compared to potentially the impact from invasive plants, which can be large. But the invasive plants often end up negatively affecting things through competition. They make it harder for native plants, etc. But when these pathogens of our native forest trees really just entirely change an ecosystem over the course of a few years. So those are my larger concerns. And again, there's not much to be done about that other than the short term. As Tony mentioned, early detection, rapid response, paying attention to diseases and vegetation growth that you're not familiar with. The long-term underlying causes are trying to be very careful with sanitary shipments and reducing the movement of biological organisms all over the place is a real big problem. And the other concern I would add, or maybe it's not a concern so much as an approach, particularly again coming from my perspective of forests and forest land, but I suppose applied to any management of any landscape. We already talked about thresholds and how do you approach certain situations and decide when to do something. When we're looking at forest lands, in a sense, often with a different eye than we might have for agricultural lands, I see the tendency to look at abundance as an indicator of when you should do something. So the most abundant forest invasive plant around here in my forest might be something like one of the bush honeysuckles, Linicera mackii or Linicera maroi. Those are the most abundant. And so I might look at those, and people might look at those and say, well, that's what I should start with. That's what I should do something about. And to me, that might be entirely the opposite view. Our landscapes around central Pennsylvania are inundated with those species. If I really wanted to get rid of them in an area, if I put in a large investment of time and money and stuck with it for 5 to 10 years, I could probably do a good job of reducing the abundance of those species. But that would take a lot of work and a lot of planning. I wouldn't be able to just do it haphazard, and I would probably just get those species back because they're all over the landscape. And so instead, when you're talking about forest management or any kind of landscape management, I suggest sort of entirely throwing out the idea necessarily of keeping track of invasive versus native pests, but just come up with a plan that has goals to it. What are the goals you have for a landscape? And if there's an abundant invasive species or an abundant weed that's not really interfering with your goals, well, then that's sort of your solution or answers the question as to whether you should do anything about it. But when you have goals as far as, well, I want to have trails through here, or I want to have a certain aesthetic through here, or I want to have a timber harvest, then you can let those goals dictate what you should prioritize as far as weed management. And instead of using abundance as your primary driver of attacking the most abundant weed, again, sort of this idea of being preventative and proactive, you should look for that new vegetation. You should try to, as well as you can, be aware of what species are in the area that you don't have yet. And those are the ones that maybe you can keep out of your woodlot. If you can be preventative as far as we talked about equipment hygiene and sanitary methods of cleaning equipment that might be moving through your area. That's something you could do something about. You could avoid introducing a new invasive pest. You could avoid making invasive pests that are in your landscape angry. If you have a small problem with tree of heaven and you do a big timber cut, well, now maybe you have a large problem of tree of heaven. And so it's more about mitigating sort of the existing issues and being very thoughtful and explicit about what your goals actually are, and then letting that drive maybe what you want to do as far as any weed management. And it might actually turn out that some of the things you want to manage are native species. If you're trying to get forest regeneration and deer are eating all the plants you want to regenerate, well, then you've got a native species that's actually your perhaps your primary concern. I think I probably said plenty. I'd be happy to take any questions. And there's a whole list of resources I've got on that page again. Oh, just one resource I mentioned briefly was the Mid-Atlantic Invasive Plant Council listserv. Our webpage is in a bit of dysfunction, but there is at least a link to the listserv there. And you don't have to join it. You can actually, I think you can search the archive without actually joining it. But the Mid-Atlantic Invasive Plant Council listserv is a really good source of figuring out exactly what types of treatment are available and useful for certain pests, as well as figuring out identifications for things that you have. And then, of course, there's other ways of doing that too, through county extension offices and things like that.
Okay. I was going to say, and our web guy, Kevin Judd, very kindly put all the resources that you had put on the PowerPoint onto a web page here. So this is
great.
the link that's showing, and folks can, and we'll put this up in the recording too, so people have access to that. And we'll make sure, we can work with you, Norris, to make sure that the Mid-Atlantic Council web link is on there too for people. So
Great.
and, great. So Nancy, are there any questions that have come in for Norris?
Yep, couple of questions. In the vein of what's new, do you have any notes about new weed biological control agents or emerging pests?
Yeah, there's always a bit of that going on. Actually, I was going to ask Tony about black swallowwort, which isn't terribly new. That was, I remember seeing that in Rhode Island in the 1990s, and I vaguely remembered there being some biocontrol effort around it. Microstegium, there's people trying to look at what maybe biocontrol efforts there. There's biocontrol efforts potentially in line for emerald ash borer. There's some already around for hemlock woolly adelgid. Perhaps the most famously and arguably successful are in natural areas and wetlands would be the biocontrol agents for purple loosestrife. There's and mile a minute. You guys don't have mile a minute north of where I am, I don't think. I hope not. But that's a nasty, super nasty annual vine that seems like there's a decent biocontrol weevil that is helpful there. So for all these invasive plants, you know, some cases there's biocontrol agents that are released. In some cases, there's biocontrol agents that are sort of in the pipeline, which is a very long pipeline. In other cases, there may be no existing effort going on about it. So it really depends on which species you're talking about.
Yeah, I'll just wanted to kind of an update on at least the swallowworts. There is a European moth that Dick Casagrande in Rhode Island, at the University of Rhode Island, has been working on for a number of years now, and it's getting close to being released in the U.S. So we were hopeful that maybe this is the year, and it might just be the year that the permits will be given out. I'll say that it's been already released in Canada over at least 2 years now. So hopefully that'll be, and the moth, is very specific to the swallowworts, both the pale and black. And so it'll be interesting to look at that, but we're certainly very encouraged that we're able to get a biological control for this species. How effective it's going to be, it's something obviously we're all going to be looking at, but it's certainly encouraging, and we're hoping that APHIS gives the go-ahead and that the moth could be released here in the U.S. So yeah, we're excited about that, and I know Dick's worked many years trying to get that through the system, because it is definitely something, a long road.
Yeah. I'd mention I've been working with Tree of Heaven. Am I on? Yeah, I'm not muted, am I? No. Working with Tree of Heaven, there's a fungal wilt that was found to be affecting Tree of Heaven in central Pennsylvania. And I've been involved in a bunch of those studies. So there's some promising biocontrol effort that exists for Tree of Heaven as well.
Thank you. And I also noticed that Elaine Botha has her hand raised. And if you need to ask a question, if you can use the Q&A feature on the bottom of the screen, that would be great. And so Nancy, are there any other questions that have come in?
Yep, I have another one. What is happening to some of our current weed species in terms of distribution patterns, climate change, and management intensities?
Whoa, that's there. I mean, so one of the issues that we need to think about is there's certainly species that are on the move. There's no doubt, no question about it. We have seen Johnson grass, I'll use Johnson grass, pretty well move into slowly into the Northeast. And in part, it's been here for a while, but we're starting to see the populations expand. And this is something we're looking at. And in part, it's difficult to tease out the impact of climate change, say our milder winters, versus our management. You know, some of these are brought in through because of management. We talked about contaminated seed, crop seed, or just sharing of equipment. And but what's of interest is that once they've been introduced, they're now able to establish and do well. Whereas, you know, early on, there are reasons why some of these species couldn't tolerate upstate New York or New England winters. A perfect example that Louis Ziska over at USDARS in Beltsville has shown with kudzu, one of our favorite invasives, obviously, kudzu, is that it was typically not problematic in the Northeast, or at least it hasn't been, because it cannot tolerate anything, any temperatures below 5 degrees Fahrenheit, or, you know, minus 15 Celsius. But as you all know, our winters have become much milder. We still get very, you know, cold spells, and so this plant is on the move, and we are seeing it. We now have it in the lower Hudson Valley of of New York, and it's in Connecticut, and so agronomic weeds are a little different because they're being, you know, again, dispersed via, you know, crop seed, you know, just people bringing things over. And so that's in part what we're trying to document is which species are coming that were not here in the past. So example, we now have in upstate New York, tall water hemp. Not that it can't survive here, but it was basically, it's moved from the Midwest through contaminated seed. And the issue there is that this is a Roundup resistant plant, or at least the biotype that we have. So, or the population that we have, where, you know, Roundup simply does not work on it. And it's come directly, we know it's in the Midwest. So I think we're gonna see more of that, and that the climate is changing, getting warmer, is allowing these more southern species to do well, at least in the Northeast region. So that's kind of why, you know, I think Norris and I said, we really need to be vigilant now. Anything new that, you know, you haven't seen, it's likely to establish here, whereas in the past we'd say, oh, winter's going to take care of it. And this is true for insect pests and pathogens. My colleagues in entomology and plant pathology say exactly the same thing. Diseases we didn't have to worry about, you know, ticks and all kinds of things now are surviving because of our moderating climate, particularly in the wintertime.
Yeah.
Thank you. And Hilary and Norris, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I was going to say the same thing about insects. Yeah.
And the only thing I was going to add is that, you know, we have certainly seen, you know, poison ivy has been a problem, but is becoming more so, and that's not surprising with changes in climate. And also we have been having more problems with some of those warm season perennial grasses, which really, you know, have always just kind of been there, but not a problem. And now in the last 4 or 5 years, they've just exploded. So again, I think this is because we're experiencing warmer winters, warmer, you know, more extreme events in our summer times, just making the conditions much more suitable to some of those types of plants.
Yeah. Really. Oh,
go ahead, Norris.
Affect the efficacy of herbicides as well. To speak totally out of my wheelhouse and talk right over the rest of the panel's wheelhouse here, but yeah, the changing climate conditions can affect how well the herbicides work on
the stress of the plants. Yeah.
I was just going to add that one thing one needs to keep in mind when you're thinking about climate change and adaptation and you know how plants evolve. These are organisms, right? So they've and particularly let's talk about weeds. I mean, their genetics are so diverse relative to our crops that we've bred and are basically, you know, almost, you know, one variety or very few. That genetic makeup is very limited. In weeds, I mean, these are wild relatives of our crops, so their genetics are such that even if some of them are going to be thrown by the wayside by a changing climate, there is going to be those genetics that are going to be really appropriate for that habitat, and that's what we're seeing. And so, you know, our crops are not able, unless our plant breeders are, you know, we're breeding specifically for drought tolerance and so forth. Weeds are doing it almost kind of natural selection. It's taking care of that, but they're basically, you know, harness of genetics is so wide that there's going to be that perfect match. And then once it's there, They, and so that's always something. It's same for some of our insects and pathogens. So, people ask, why aren't we seeing that in our crops? Well, because of that limited, genetic composition, because we bred for yield and other traits that we're interested in, while relatives, their genetics are just, they're basically well adapted to change.
Okay, great, thank you. Nancy, do you have any other questions come in?
Yeah, I had an herbicide question, coincidentally. Are natural-based product herbicides like acetic acid and pine oil worthwhile to use?
It all depends. I've had an organic grower that, with very special attention, using acetic acid, either as like an injection mode or something like that, can get, some activity. But, in my experience, unless you're working with a burn down product, the natural products, in my mind, don't, hold a candle to the synthetic herbicides. But if that's all you have and you're trying to be organic, she was certainly convinced that doing this was absolutely better than doing nothing. So, but I think you have to be very, conscious of, when's the best application window, making sure you have the right dosage, again, making sure your plants aren't stressed so that they can be, more susceptible to whatever kind of treatment that you're giving them. I think it's a challenge. I don't know, Tony, if you've had more experience. But.
No, I would agree. I mean, certainly, the growers that I've worked with, they typically aren't using natural products. They're really looking at kind of the, the classic kind of IPM without obviously herbicides, really thinking rotation. Soil health is a big deal for our, I think that's, having a healthy soil is really key. Keeping pests, insects, weeds, in our case, off balance by rotating. I mean, we keep talking about rotating, but that is such an important, you think about going from corn and soybeans to maybe wheat, where the rows are narrow and so forth. Certain weeds are going to be, and certain insects are going to be adapted to those crops. But in terms of, to answer the question, as far as I know, yeah, they're rather limited, and depending on environmental conditions, they're really susceptible to, the efficacy can drop very quickly. But as Hilary mentioned, some of the growers that I work with, and they've used clove oil as well, and acetic acid. They, again, these are very meticulous. They really believe in the cause, and I mean, I'm supportive. But for folks who are just kind of doing it as part of, a more broad kind of management, if you don't follow closely, the efficacy just isn't there, and then you're really disappointed. So I've seen it work, but it's not always the case.
I think it's one of those circumstances where you have to believe it's going to work. And it's your faith in the product, makes you more optimistic about the results that you see.
Certainly, if you're looking at non-selective products, they, as burn down, as Hilary talked about, they're effective.
Yep.
For above ground burn down, like a equivalent to a paraquat, where you're just trying to burn the top growth. Acetic acid, I'll tell you, you can spray salt.
Right.
It does a great job. We all know what happens in the wintertime with de-icing salt. But again, in terms of selectively controlling a broadleaf in a grass or vice versa, it's a little more touchy there. But it can work. But the conditions have to be really right, and you have to know what you're doing.
Right, and it's really challenging if you have a perennial crop, where you don't have discrete rows, or you have very minimal, space to work in. It makes it much harder. And also, if you say, even if in an orchard, if you have ground cover that you're trying to preserve, you don't want to be spraying pelargonic acid out there because you're going to destroy your ground cover. So, it can be challenging.
Thank you.
Okay.
And then, oops, Nancy and I are playing with a mute.
On the other end of the spectrum, do you see bio and robotic technology affecting weed management?
Well, I can kind of jump in on that. From robotic, I think that they're probably talking about using unmanned aerial systems and vehicles, and that's an area that I'm just getting into, and I think is going to make a big impact, especially on weed management, because you're going to be able to fly these drones over your fields, not have to walk them, and be able to, I think, get some pretty accurate weed maps of what's going on, and then use your precision agriculture to go out there and make applications. And again, I think eventually we're going to have, you know, these unmanned vehicles that are going to be able to do great spray applications. So I think that's going to be an exciting game changer for weed management.
Yeah, I think we're seeing some, and Dr. Steve Young, the director of the Northeast IPM Center, can tell you a lot more about that. But there's already some great technology, you know, weed ID vision technology being used out in California, and where basically, you know, these robots and machines are able to discriminate the crop from a weed, and also think about the kind of herbicide to be sprayed at what rate. I mean, this is where we're at. This is moving very fast. I think this is where, you know, weed scientists, the plant ecologists, and so forth, IPM, you know, practitioners come in, because the engineers can kind of push the you know, machine technology, but we've got to bring the agronomic and natural areas expertise to these folks. And so, but yeah, I would definitely say in IPM, this is becoming a, you know, just like you say, flying over fields, detecting nutrient deficiency, insect damage, weed patches. Now you don't have to spray the whole field. It's absolutely a game changer. That's my sense, especially with the cost gonna, you know, really gonna come down. I have a real sense that's gonna happen, and all these new startups that are moving into this field. So
the other aspect of that might be, I'm not sure if that question related at all to CRISPR technology that is being rapidly developed, and that's CRISPR. If you're not familiar with it, is, I mean, you may as well think of it as sort of the next generation genetically modified organisms, where there can be very precise edits to the genomes of different species, and so you can really very specifically alter the genetics of a particular species, which of course offers incredible promise and comes with quite a potential for unintended consequences as well. And I should say the ethic, I mean, it's not like the ethics of discussing this are new, because they've existed with genetically modified organisms in general before, but there's general misunderstanding within the public about conventional, or I guess what maybe you would call pre-CRISPR GMO, and the CRISPR revolution is not likely to make everybody suddenly understand GMOs any better. But I think it'd be all the more important to have scientists involved at every level as those technologies proceed.
Okay, thank you. Well, we're coming to the end of our time. We have 2 minutes. So I just want to say thank you to each of our guests. Thank you for your thoughtfulness, and thank you for your careers that have allowed you to answer these questions in a way that is fun and entertaining for everyone. I want to just give each of you 30 seconds, 20 seconds, 15 seconds with one last comment, one last thought, and we'll start with you, Norris.
Geez, one last thought. I guess my last thought is to be thoughtful. And again, the amount of energy and expense you can run when you're trying to control weed problems or invasive species problems can be really high. And so be informed before you make any decisions about what to do.
Okay, great. And Tony, what about for you?
Just reiterating, you know, being on top of any new plants that you see, and that's so critical. The other thing I want to say is I know we're talking about weeds as pests, but I'm also a believer that weeds have beneficial impacts. And I think we shouldn't lose sight of that, because they're really plants out of place. And no question, you know, a milkweed, you know, in corn in large quantities is negative. But we've also shown, and others have shown, that they also have some benefits if you're looking at natural areas. So I want to keep an open mind, although my goal is obviously to manage these pests in an integrated way. So.
All right, Hilary, we've got 1 minute, so you can have
Okay,
30
so-
seconds of it.
Sure. No, just to kind of cycle around, I think it kind of brings through what everybody's been speaking about it, and through being informed and knowing what you're working with. I think, you know, before you start tackling any kind of weed problem, make sure that you know what you're tackling. I mean, I've definitely worked with growers that just, they haven't been as confident as I would like to have seen them in what they're actually targeting. And when they come and say, hey, should I spray this? I'm always, what are you targeting? And to make sure that you're doing the right curative or the right strategy for the right target. So, you know, make sure that you use, there's lots of great resources out there. Norris put up some, you know, the new weed guide that's going to come out, the Northeast. There's so many good online resources. So make sure you know what you got.
Wonderful. Well, thank you everyone for your questions and your time and your attention. And this recording will be up on our website, and we'll send a notice out to all the people who are registered, and also to our listserv. So I hope it's been valuable and a good use of people's time and energy. So thanks very much. Okay, all right, bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.